Okay, so I'll try and be super quick. Yes, this presentation is part of our Preserving Immersive Media project at Tate, and that's supported by Luminart projects. Basically, we've been sort of trying as best we can to develop a high-level preservation strategy. So I'm just going to give you a very brief timeline of the project leading us to where we are now. So we'd started at Tate to look at documenting complex physical installations with VR tools, and the complexities of stabilizing that material that we were generating led us to do some preliminary research. We were then contacted by Judy at Central St Martin's Art School in London, who they had acquired a work by one of their students, which was a photogrammetry work made in Steam's Hammer editor by the artist Dom Biddulph. And her approaching us sort of stimulated us to do a bit more research. And we became quite quickly aware that a vast quantity of work is being made using these technologies, which is definitely in immediate danger of being lost, given the precarity of the systems that support it, which is something that we're all united in understanding. And we were then put in contact with Luminart projects, who support artists working with technology, and they supported our project and put us in contact with some of their artists. So it's worth saying that while this project is focused on VR, we're also, like, a lot of what we're exploring is to do with real-time 3D technologies, so we're keen to keep that as part of the conversation. So we interviewed 4 artists or artist collectives, and all expressed preservation concerns, not just in the long term, but expressed how hard it was to keep these works going due to this auto update phenomenon. And we were curious if artists had some ideas about how their works might change in the future. As a result of this, some were open to the idea of accessing these virtual environments in new ways as technology allowed. We analysed their workflows and their production environments, and we found some common themes. Most were made using existing game engines and with assets from a variety of sources, some purchased from commercial platforms. And it was interesting to note how their artistic intent intersected with the technology, ranging from the engines being an environment in which they sort of felt they could freely experiment and work, to a tool just kind of being used to carry out a very particular artistic vision. And I think that kind of difference could have some potential impact on the way we think about these works in the long term. We also did a sort of dry run of what our acquisitions process might look like, which included them filling in and collaboratively refining this draft acquisition template. And Tom will talk a bit more about that. And it's interesting to see all of you guys coming up with your versions of that, and it would be really amazing to share those. So we started to make contact with people in cultural heritage institutions whose interests aligned, and many of you are joining us today. We presented alongside many of you at Central St Martin's at the Vanishing Point conference, the curation and preservation of VR. And shortly after this, we had our first very small technical workshop at Tate, and that was around 15 people from related industries. We had sort of those making architectural VR models represented, those making 360 video players, as Savannah mentioned earlier. And we wanted to kind of like share our experience and refine our thinking as a collective. And one of the key actions, I think, that we took away from that workshop was this kind of wider industry engagement. And this is what we're trying to bring today. So as the list of people who we collaborated with grew, it seemed to make sense to try and connect all of you people and enable us to sort of share info. And so we started the it's quite a mouthful, isn't it? Preserving Immersive Media Group email list, which many of you I think are signed up to, and we can sort of host documents on that. So we are all now right now at the present point in the second of our workshops, and yeah, just a sort of theme of the day is we'd be really interested to know from all of you about the sort of format, online versus in person, if it's been helpful, how we can refine it, if you'd like to see it take a particular form. So please give us all your feedback and we can talk about that at the end maybe. Next up was the iPres Hackathon, which we hosted alongside Claudia Rook, who we heard from earlier, and Dragan Espenschied. We looked at 2 case studies, and our aim was to explore possible variables in these artworks by trying them, by undergoing sort of various types of migration. That might be hardware migration, or like operating system migration, or just migrations to newer versions of the production environments, which would enable exporting for a new bit of hardware. And we have some collaborative notes from that. So the sort of outline of the hackathon, along with the daily log of our activities, there's a link for that in our collaborative notes that we're all working on today. So you can have a look through that. But in brief, the result was that we did see noticeable change through those migration paths, but something that quickly surfaced is that we all struggled to communicate between each other as to exactly what those changes were. And in response to that, we had some amazing contributors who worked tirelessly on developing a glossary of terms, which kind of drew from and underpinned our discussions. And it would be really amazing to see something like that continue. And I think that's over to you, Tom.
Cool, thanks, Jack. So yeah, last year we also went to SIGGRAPH, which is the annual conference of the computer graphics industry. We presented a paper there on the project and generally just tried to kind of make a case for preservation. It was also a chance to gain a clearer picture of what's going on in the industry and the kind of direction of VR at the moment. And no surprises, it's largely the opposite of preservation focused. So the priority continues to be on innovation. Having said that, the closest we found to kind of kindred spirits at SIGGRAPH were those at the Kronos group sessions, which for people that don't know is an industry consortium who develop and maintain open standards for computer graphics. So this session included an update on OpenXR, which is something we've talked about in previous presentations a bit, and the release of the first specification of that standard coincided with SIGGRAPH, so it was cool to hear more about that. We had some early chats with people from Kronos about the possibility of representatives from the cultural heritage sector sitting on an advisory panel. So these were fairly tentative discussions, but hopefully it's something we can come back to later. We're really fortunate that Jacob Bornkrantz from Calabria and the Kronos group has agreed to join us today to talk more about Kronos's open standards. So I will leave that there for now. So moving on to some of our document outputs. The first of these was an acquisition information gathering template. And we've already heard a bit about a few of those today, and this was our stab at that. So this came out of a need we identified for a tool to help gather information at the early stages of a VR acquisition. And this was devised to be really carried out in collaboration with artists. So we took the opportunity of the relationships we had in place to test it out on the artists we interviewed, and we also got some really helpful input from the Preserving Immersive Media group. And Savannah Campbell and Mark Heller have since created a great expansion of this template, which really supersedes it. And both of these documents are available on the group's IO page. So yeah, I think we encourage further enhancements to this and people sharing their own documents. So we've just finished up work on a white paper. And the idea behind this paper was to provide a technical overview of the current generation of VR technologies, identify preservation risks, and try and come up with some recommendations for how to proceed from here. So it represents a kind of snapshot of our work so far, and this particular kind of slice in time. And I think it's just worth saying that inherently means it's incomplete and will probably become out of date fairly quickly. I think it could be interesting to discuss as a group whether we have alternatives to this kind of static document type publishing. But that's a discussion for another time. So for now, we've got this up online as a Google Doc. We've added a link on the slide, but you can also find it in the event Google Drive folder. And it's also now in the collaborative notes. So we're keen to get everyone's feedback on this to help us improve it. So if you can spare the time to have a read through, please do add your comments, suggestions and corrections. We'd be so grateful for it. So the first 3 main sections introduce the technologies, analysing each for preservation risks and points of variability. So we go through VR systems, real-time 3D VR and 360 video VR in turn. And we don't cover AR, augmented reality or mixed reality in this paper, but we imagine some of the information will be useful for those other forms of immersive media. So in section 5, we go into a bit more detail, what kind of, I guess, it becomes a bit more speculative as we look at existing digital preservation strategies and consider how they might be applied to VR. And then in the final section, we present our recommendations, which we're going to delve into in a bit more detail now. So in the report, we split this first set of recommendations up into recommendations for artists and recommendations for collecting institutions, but they are fairly similar. So we have actually summarized them together here just in order to fit it into a short presentation. So I think it's worth stating before going through these that these are intended to be pragmatic recommendations to guide those facing the immediate prospect of caring for a VR artwork. So as a result, they prioritize the short-term stabilization of important materials. And, you know, we have to say we don't know how often these will need to be reviewed. We can take a stab and say we think at most every 3 years, based on the time periods within which VR hardware seems to be getting phased out for newer hardware, but it's very hard to predict. So our general recommendations for VR artworks are adapted from those we have in place for software-based artworks at Tate. So the most important of these is to ensure you have a complete system, all the hardware and software configured, tested, and working offline. And offline is particularly important here, as various components in the VR software stack use the web automatically and may force automatic updates, potentially breaking parts of that system. And as we would for any other software-based artwork, we recommend creating a second complete backup of this system where budgets allow. As we would for software-based artworks, we recommend raw disk images are created from storage volumes. And this separates the software environment from the physical storage devices and so opens up options for disk image-based emulation in the future. The Tate approach to disk imaging is now fairly well formalized. I've been doing a lot of work on that over the last couple of years, and fingers crossed we'll be sharing some more information about that as part of the software-based art preservation project in the coming months. So for real-time 3D artworks, we recommend some additional actions are taken. Firstly, that software builds are created for as many suitable platforms as possible. So looking at creating builds for different operating systems, but also giving thought to support for different 3D APIs and different VR runtimes through the use of plugins and SDKs. So this is simply to give us the maximum number of options for keeping the software executable in the future. And this is often actually relatively straightforward to do if you have access to source materials, because most game engines provide options for cross-compilation. So we also give some guidelines regarding production materials, which, given the huge amount of uncertainty around how we'll apply preservation strategies in the future, we think are very important for artists and archive museums. Sorry. Very important for artists to archive and museums to seek to acquire. So again, this is ultimately keeping our options open and would allow us to do things like migration in the future. So for artists, this means careful management of source projects alongside suitable engine binaries with which they can actually open those projects. For museums, this means acquiring these, testing them, and ideally creating disk images, encapsulating the complete software environment. And it's probably worth saying as well that we have some concerns about whether this should include separate preservation pathways for assets and asset production materials like 3D modeling tools. as the current generation of engines do allow some form of export for most assets, we feel this is a lower priority, but could be important for certain kinds of artwork. Yeah, finally, just to note that as we would for other software-based artworks, we'd recommend the use of version control software in any future development work in the course of preservation activities. So I'm going to bounce back to Jack for some stuff on 360 video.
Yeah, so we touched on this a little bit earlier, but just attempt to play that file on as many players as possible, which is kind of pretty standard practice for our flat or planar video acquisition. But there is much greater potential error for differences in projection types, which Savannah was talking about earlier on, and for rendering the ambisonic or spatial audio. Both of those have very subtle differences in conventions, so that requires extra care there. There's a new spatial media metadata standard put forward by Google. In fact, I should probably find a link for that and put that on the communal, on the collaborative notes. That's certainly addresses a lot of the issues that we've seen, but it's definitely in its infancy, and it would be really, it's kind of too early to say how widely adopted that will be. In the case of works that are captured from camera, they are often as a result of multi-camera arrays, and they are stitched together into much lower resolution files, and therefore a very lossy process. There are several bottlenecks that affect the playing of 360 video files, and resolution is definitely one of them. And given that that's set to improve, there could be a case for archiving the raw camera capture for future stitching as kind of storage and stitching performance increases. And again, we talked about this earlier on, but it was interesting to see Savannah land on this as well, because it did kind of almost seem counterintuitive to me, but I think there is definitely a case for all of those reasons around improving performance of keeping that production environment and perhaps re-exporting 360 video to suit evolving technologies. That's back to you, is it, Tom?
Yeah. So we also have some recommendations for further work, which we identified during our research, and unsurprisingly, given the early stages of our understanding of VR preservation, there's a lot more work to do. So firstly, we feel that we need to be monitoring the development and supporting the adoption of open standards in VR. While it's kind of early days in this area, it will be particularly interesting to see how OpenXR takes shape. It seems unlikely that open standards of this kind will solve our digital preservation problems outright, but they should definitely make our lives easier. We also identified that we need to keep an eye on emulation and compatibility tools and support these projects where we can. Emulation currently has limited support for 3D rendering and thus VR, but could be very important in the future. I know Ben Vinaradin will be reporting on some new research him and his team at Small Data Industries have been doing later on today. Compatibility layers are just worth a quick note as a kind of distinct but related thing. So I think these tools are showing real promise as things that will help with preservation of this kind. For example, the Wine project for Linux allows Windows applications to be run on Linux and has some support for Direct3D. Another interesting project is Revive, which allows applications which exclusively target the Oculus runtime to be run on Steam VR. For real-time 3D preservation, there is even more work to be done. Firstly, we again highlight the need for monitoring open standards, and again, Chronos standards like Vulkan could make our lives easier here. We also think there's much more research to be done in understanding how a preservation approach closer to maintenance could be useful for VR preservation. So incremental migration could be one way to keep obsolescence at bay, and our experiments with this at the iPres hackathon last year showed some potential. but there are still lots of questions about how frequently this would need to be carried out and the resources it require. It's a kind of real shift in mindset. So while we made some inroads into this in our research, we think there's more to be done in terms of understanding variability in real-time 3D rendering. And we think this will be important knowledge if we're going to be able to understand how change impacts these characteristics when we migrate and emulate. Preservation of 3D model formats is something we only touched on in our research, and again needs more work if we're going to be able to use formats to stabilize 3D assets. And the Library of Congress has really been leading the way on this work, and Kate, Jamie, and Eileen will be talking more about this work later today. So finally, for real-time 3D, there's more work to be done in understanding how we might capture fixed view and 360 video from real-time 3D artworks. So I think this is interesting because it's a documentation strategy which allows some semblance of the original experience of the artwork while removing reliance on real-time rendering. And we found when trying to use existing tools with real-time 3D applications, we found there's a real limitation to what we could do and whether we could understand where the video is being captured in the rendering pipeline. And the best tools that we found were reliant on having access to source projects. So we think there's a lot more that could be done here and scope for better tools. I'm going to bounce back to Jack for one last time.
Yeah, so again, recommendations for further work for 360 video preservation, just monitoring the evolution of those metadata standards and their adoption. As we stated, they're relatively young and fast evolving standards. And yeah, monitor this evolution of projection formats and implications for player compatibility and sustainability. The evolution of projection types is very interesting. At the moment, they're being driven by online platforms such as Facebook and YouTube at a considerable rate. And whilst they're driving for sort of streaming efficiency, I think because of the sort of huge file sizes in 360 video, it's likely that we'll see those techniques, those sort of efficiency techniques filter into file playback within the gallery, I think. All of this is explored in a lot more detail in our white paper. So yeah, just as Tom said earlier, it'd be great if you could all take a read of that at your leisure and comment at will. Don't be too harsh on us.
As you can probably tell, we've solved absolutely nothing in our 2 years of research.
The recommendations is definitely the questions is like the biggest section, and the recommendations the smallest. Yeah. So I think that's everything.
So we're immediately thrust into the weird position of moderating our own questions, but we're actually running so much over time, I think it's probably time to jump to the next break.